vedere voi? Noi?
Dovrebbe poter vedere
Noi?
Credo di sì.
La sala o noi?
Non lo so. Margherita, lei chi vede? La sala da così? Non noi, sala così. No, secondo me no, vede la sala. No, ma era solo per sapere. Good afternoon. If we take a seat in a couple of minutes, we can start this session. Questo rimane acceso. Non so perché anch'io ho provato.
Bene saperlo prima di fare qualche caffè.
Parlare.
Il microfono aperto.
Sì, ma non... figurati. Già che paghiamo la sala, usiamola al meglio. Funziona? Se no... Va? Ok, iniziamo, dai. Okay, good afternoon. We can start this plenary session. This plenary session number 4 is the last one. But as you know, we will have more workshops later, so it's not the last part of the conference. And I'm very glad about this plenary. We decided as title, what do and do not workers want today, addressing inequalities in modern labor market. So our focus is about labor market, is about workers in labor market, wages, inequalities, flexibility. So vast program, we can say. And we have for this important goal two speakers. We are very glad of having here with us physically Georg Picot from the University of Bergen, and to have here connected, but with a huge screen, so is part of our audience today, Professor Yung Chung, coming from the King's College in London. I'm not adding any other information or a big introduction, because we want to have time to discuss also later. So we will have the two presentations about 30 minutes, and then we will have time around, I hope, around 30 minutes for a deep Q&A session. So write down your questions while you listen, because we will have a lot of time to discuss the two presentations. So we start with Professor Yung Chung, and that has a presentation entitled The Flexibility Paradox, What Flexible Working Means for Inequalities. So, Professor Chung, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm sorry I can't be there in physical form, but I am there with you in spirit. So I'm going to talk. I'm Yi Jung. I'm a professor of work and employment at King's Business School, as well as the King's incoming director for King's Global Institute for Women's Leadership. So today I wanted to talk to you about how flexible working can, or what it means for inequality. So before I set off, and I can't see the audience, so I'm just going to ask you, so how many of us before the pandemic especially thought that working from home was going to be this amazing thing for workers' well-being, work-family integration, but also, as many of the kind of governments have said, including the European Commission, the UK government definitely said flexible working was going to maybe solve all the inequality issues, especially gender inequality issues that we see in the labor market at home. So all of us had given this kind of promise of flexible working, solving many of the kind of challenges that we have in society, again, with well-being, but also inequalities. Now, what we find during the pandemic is that actually, rather than addressing workers' well-being, rather than us achieving gender inequality, that sometimes we have seen an exacerbation of some of these issues. As this comic shows, is that sometimes the working from home and flexible working has actually resulted in the boundary blurring, where rather than workers having control over when and where they work, they end up kind of with work bleeding into every aspect of our lives. And that's kind of what my talk, as well as what this book that I've published last year, was about. So the flexibility paradox, again, is about when workers gain more control over when and where they work. That is with flexi time, working time autonomy, or teleworking, they end up working harder and longer. So rather than flexible working, again, enabling workers to work anywhere and any time they want, they end up working everywhere and all the time. And one of the contributions that I make, again, today in this talk, but also in the book, is that there are implications of this for especially gender inequalities as well as intersectional inequalities, and especially with regards to the stigmatized views we have on flexible working. So before I go on, I think it's important to know what I mean by flexible working again. So there's different types of flexible workings that people think of. And before the pandemic, it has been mostly on kind of part-time work. And that's not what this is about. So this is really about giving workers control over the starting and ending times of work, as well as being able to work kind of outside of your worker's premises. So working at home, for example. If you look at the levels of remote working or working from home prior to the pandemic, you see that we saw that on average, about 1 out of 7 or 8 workers were working from home. And even that wasn't on really a regular basis, that it was mostly when, the plumber had to come in to fix something, you were working from home, or if you had something else on like that, you had to do it like on ad hoc occasions. What we see post-pandemic, or not like just, this is 2021, so it's kind of in the midst of the pandemic, but this kind of figures kind of, we could see after the pandemic and in 23, 24 as well, is that, remote working has increased tremendously. In many countries, up to half of workers, of all workers, were working from home. And I mean, you do see quite a large variation here. It's especially the Southern European countries as well as Eastern European countries where teleworking is not as frequent, whereas you see a lot of the Nordic countries, UK, Belgium, Luxembourg, and largely due to potentially the economic structures of those countries, but other things as well. You see a huge proportion of workers working from home quite regularly, and this is quite. This isn't just like at any time, but this is quite regularly working from home, at least kind of like, let's say 2-3 days a week. What we also see is that before the pandemic, we saw mostly men working from home. And one of the reasons for which is because employers didn't really trust women to work from home, because they believed that when women work from home, they're not going to really work, that they're going to focus more on their household tasks, etc. Whereas during the pandemic and even after that, we've seen more women that are able to be or are working from home on a regular basis compared to men. And this isn't, explained through the labor structures or the jobs that they carry alone, but it's to do with kind of some of the patterns and possibly the preferences as well. Now, flexible working can be incredibly beneficial for addressing inequality patterns. And one of the reasons for that is when you have a workplace where you force workers to come into the office every day from 9 to 5, or even 9 to 6, 7 in many countries, like Italy, I know that is the case, that you're not going to be allowing certain groups of the populations to take part in the labor market, and not at least in full-time work. And one of the biggest groups of that is women with caring responsibilities, especially childcare responsibilities, especially in societies where women are expected to do most of the childcare and housework. It's just impossible to be able to go into the office every day, 7 hours, 9 hours a day, or even longer. So when you give women the possibility to work from home or work flexibly, you see that they're less likely to drop out of the labor market once they have children, but also they're less likely to reduce their working hours. Now, we know from numerous data across different countries that, dropping out of the labor market and moving into part-time work is one of the biggest causes of why we see the gender pay gap. So again, this can be really beneficial for addressing some of that gender inequality patterns. We see similar results for disabled workers. So we saw from other studies that disabled workers are much more able to engage in the labor market, but also work longer hours if you give them flexible working. We also saw results for ethnic minority workers, so in what we in the UK call Black and minority ethnic workers, where they were able to not only take part in the labor market, but also just engage better in the labor market, because still in many of our societies, there is still quite like a lot of microaggression towards certain marginalized groups, such as ethnic minority workers or LGBT plus workers, where home provides a kind of a safe haven to better engage in work. Not to say that we shouldn't address these problems in the workplace, but whilst these problems exist, it is still better for these workers, marginalized groups perhaps, who sometimes better to work from home because of those possibilities. Also, we see flexible working be beneficial for well-being outcomes as well, one of which is because, one of the most coveted things what people look for in jobs, in most cases, other than income, or possibly even as much as income levels, is the ability to work flexibly. It is one of the most popular arrangements that we see in many, many kind of worker surveys. And, the pure fact that especially remote working, you reduce commuting times, but also preparation times, it gives people back time, huge amounts of time and energy that they could be spending on other things, including improving their well-being, but also improving family relationship, or just reducing the stress of having to deal with both the work demands and family demands. So this is why we see that flexible working is associated with happier workers, more motivated workers, loyal workers, reduction in kind of turnover of workers, increase in retention, reduction in sickness absenteeism. And that all, links to productivity and performance outcomes as well. So, so that. But again, there's this big but. So having said that, flexible working can make workers work longer and harder. I'm not going to go into too much of the details of the empirical outcomes of it, but if anyone's interested, and you could take a look at the book or some of the articles that I've published, most of which are open access. And using German data, UK household data, and also drawing from work of others in the US and then elsewhere, we see that those who have blurred boundaries between work and private time, rather than, as in the popular imaginary, we kind of slack off and work less, actually you end up working longer. And again, this is from longitudinal data where you track down individuals and see what happens once they move into, let's say, flexible schedules or teleworking. They're also more likely to think about work when not at work. They're also more likely to work during their free time. And again, this has been found not just by myself, but a number of colleagues across the world. Interestingly enough, holding stable across quite a large number of contexts. And there's a number of reasons why this happens. Some colleagues have talked about, other theories, but I wanted to kind of focus on some of the theories that I drew from in my book. And the first one is that, we are living, using the works of Foucault, subjectification, but also even drawing from Weber's idea of the kind of entrepreneurial spirit of capitalism, that we are living in a capitalized society, a neoliberalistic one, where, first of all we do has to be kind of equated to economic performance and market values, to the point where even from birth, a lot of the younger generation has been geared towards every single activities have been equated to what would that mean for job opportunities, career opportunities. So rather than in these fixed working hours, where we could actually almost in a way provide us with some sort of protection mechanisms or kind of boundaries that could protect our freedom or free time, the flexible working and the blurring of boundaries that it brought in the light of internalized capitalism, and in a context where despite the changes we see in society, the ideal worker, the most productive or motivated worker, is seen as someone who devotes themselves to work very long hours, and has no other responsibilities outside of work. That kind of context puts individuals not at the risk of managers' exploitation, but under self-exploitation, that you have to be working hard, you have to be kind of thinking about what this is going to do for your career outcomes. And, we are in a society where busyness at work is seen as a badge of honor. This is especially, exacerbated by this ideas of, work, passion at work. So in a way, like, it's great that, people could love their work and enjoy their work, but then it is used as a way, again, for exploitation, where because you love your work, why wouldn't you want to do it all the time, right? So it enables, in that sense, that flexible boundaries enables workers to actually work very accessibly to the point they crowd out their leisure time or private time. And again, this is not just because workers want to. We're living in a real high levels of insecurity for all workers, even the middle class workers. And even in the top end high performance workers, I think there's a huge level of competition that we see in the labor market, where one can never kind of be let down, and that you have to always be competing against your peers, and again, for a number of things. And again, this has also been exacerbated by the fact that despite the rise of remote working, we still live in a society where lots of people feel like remote workers are slackers, that there is a huge kind of number of business leaders who talk about flexible workers as being someone, that are not really serious about work, or they're not productive, et cetera. So, the likes of the Elon Musk or Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan, but this is not just restricted to them, but it's very widespread, to the point where about a third of European workers have said, flexible workers are viewed negatively. In that sense, workers don't have any other option but to kind of exploit themselves further when working flexibly, just to overcompensate for some of these kind of negative views. Now, the gender aspects of it is that, these exploitations do not necessarily finish in the workplace. That for women, this patterns of exploitation happen also in the home sphere. So what that means is, as I mentioned, in the light of kind of the neoliberalistic society, parents have also been asked to be engaging with childcare in a much more serious manner, so to say, where you are asked to do what we call intensive parenting. So considering every aspect of one's childhood as a potential investment into the child's future labor market potential. Now, with that, what we see is that more and more parents, especially mothers, are being pressured into spending more enrichment time with children, much more than possibly the 1960s, 70s childhoods looked like. So what that does is flexible working enables women to do both paid work as well as unpaid work. And with unpaid work, what we're seeing is that women are using that flexibility at work, let's say working from home, having flexible schedules, to engage more in childcare. So what they're doing is they're squeezing in as much work, because obviously unpaid childcare is work and potentially even stressful than paid labor. They're squeezing in their 24 hours, 7 days, which hasn't changed since, the beginning of time, as much labor as they possibly can through flexible working. So in a way, flexible working has been a really good tool to try to maximize the female labor exploitation, again, both in the at home, but also in the labor market, without changing the notions of what a worker looks like, which is based on the 1950s breadwinner model, and without changing the notion of who should be doing the childcare and housework, where it is women, despite the fact that, again, more and more women are working full-time, more and more women are actually out earning their male partners in heterosexual relationships. And what that is doing is that we see that flexible working, as I mentioned, can really increase the well-being of workers, but it actually can exacerbate some of the well-being outcomes for women, or at least women are not seeing those benefits of flexible working well-being associations, because what they're being asked to do is to exploit as much labor as they possibly can. And it also kind of related to the whole inequalities element. There is a potential danger of the marginalized workers, again, women with caring responsibilities, but others as well, to be the ones that are being penalized more often when they work flexibly. So the flexibility stigma, again, is the idea that flexible workers are not as motivated, committed, and as productive. And this is why flexible working, remote working can lead to negative career outcomes. Again, this isn't based on some sort of empirical evidence of flexible workers being slackers or working less. Actually, on the contrary, as I mentioned in the earlier sections of my talk, that is actually the flexible workers who do more, if not, compared to sometimes the office workers. But because of this perception, we see a lot of the career penalties, and the question arises, who is going to see this penalty more? Now, the empirical studies around this is that actually fathers do see a lot of that penalty compared to fathers working in the office. Fathers working from home see a lot of that income penalty, and this is based on experimental work that I've conducted. But that doesn't tell the full story. What the full story actually is that in-office moms, so mothers working in the office, they're seen quite negatively already, because the fact that your mother is already viewed with a lot of suspicion. So you working from home isn't going to add much to that suspicion. But at the end of the day, the home working does also even puts your perceived productivity or commitment even lower than what your starting point was, which was lower than anyone else in the labor market. But what's more important is that some of the work that we've conducted, again, with Sen Wang and others, is that when it is the mothers who are working from home largely, so when it is seen as kind of a mother's arrangement, it's that mothers are working from home but not everyone else, or these policies that are geared mostly towards mothers, it is then when flexible working is viewed negatively most. And not only just for fathers or workers without children, but also for mothers. So having policies targeted to mothers or carers, if you want, isn't going to will penalize everyone, but also including mothers. It doesn't even protect mothers from being that penalization. Actually, it exacerbates it for everyone. Now, this is really problematic because for those of you who know and who do follow the European Commission kind of policies, is that the Work-Life Balance Directive was fantastic in providing workers with right to flexible working, but it wasn't for all workers. It was specifically geared towards only parents and carers. So it is setting it up so that flexible workers may not even get access to it, but when they get access to it, they're going to be penalized. And as I mentioned in the very first slides that I showed, it is actually women who are taking up remote working more often or staying in these remote jobs despite employers asking them to come back to the office, which will see not only stigmatization of flexible workers in general, but because it is the women who are in these jobs, we are going to possibly see a two-tiered labor market where women are working flexibly, getting the career penalties while men go into the office and get the career premiums. Just to make the picture even gloomier, because of the stigmatization, what we're also seeing is a huge rise in this always-on cultures, this digital connectivity at work. And again, this is digital connectivity for remote workers, but also non-remote workers as well. And what we see is that it is the marginalized workers who feel the pressure of having to, check your emails in the evenings, on the weekends, on holidays, just, wake up and check your work emails. Check your work emails before you go to bed. Like that kind of pattern is really prevalent across Europe or across the world, really. And this isn't just because certain people have bad habits. We have to look at the social kind of context in which these workers are embedded in. And it is going to be those workers who are already seen with this, viewed with suspicion of their work capacities, that are being kind of pushed to do these digital presenteeism, again, with incredibly negative consequences for their well-being. I have some evidence on this based on some recent data I've collected, but I'm going to be doing some more work on this as well. But it is not all doom and gloom, people. There are ways we could tackle this. So one of the things, again, is to ensure that flexible working is for everyone, not just for parents and carers. And the other thing is that we need to start looking at flexible working as a smart working productivity enhancing policy rather than a work-life balance or social justice or gender equity policies. Because only when policies like flexible working or reduction of working hours, 4-day week, or anything you want to say, is seen as a smart working tool, then are you going to see these stigmatized views around these policies reduced. Again, based on the empirical research that are conducted, we see that once we pose these policies as kind of smart working tools, then you see that these stigmatized views disappear, and this has been also shown in field experiments as well. The right to disconnect, again, is really important. I think, the European Commission will be coming up with certain policies around this soon. But again, given also the audience we have, and one of the key things here is that the right and the law in itself is going to be absolutely toothless unless we have some sort of other workers' rights involved as well, one of which is collective bargaining rights and the increase of union power, because most of these applications are going to have to be down at the company level, and it is only through unions and collective bargaining can these policies be implemented properly, but also have any teeth, because there is no chance that the labor inspectorates are going to be able to go down to every company and see if it is being applied properly. And it's in a way only workers' representations that could do that job. We need to change gender roles. A lot of the problems that I mentioned, again, has to do with problematic natures of the way we think about men and women's roles. And I think one of the things I really want to highlight is the need for fathers to work flexibly, fathers to work shorter hours, and be more engaged in childcare and housework. Not because of supporting women, it's because it's good for them. It's good for themselves, and it's good for their children. Children have higher cognitive ability development if fathers are involved. Children have less psychological problems if they're involved. Men have less psychological problems if they're involved in childcare as well. They have a better day if they are involved in childcare. And so, these are really important things to think about. But I want to end with this. So one of the things I've been kind of talking about a lot recently is that, and people are asked, so what do we do to tackle inequality, especially gender inequality in society? Can we do flexible working? Is 4-day week the right answer to that? Or, what is it? Or is it like women's quota? Is it, I've been, asked to do a lot of those kind of discussions, and even like, violence against women and stuff. What's the answer? And the problem is that these policies don't do much unless we change the way we think about the worker, our work culture, and again, the ideal worker. Because our ideal worker is still based on this 1950s breadwinner model, who has a female partner who carries out all of his reproductive work. So this female partner takes care of the children, takes care of the elderly parents, cooks, cleans, even takes care of my own, the breadwinner's own self-care by, making sure that his well-being is tip top, right? And that model doesn't exist anymore. Not is it only exclusionary towards women or ethnic minority workers who have a lot of emotional labor, but it doesn't even fit the middle-class white man now, right? Like, I don't know who can really be seen as someone who could really devote themselves only to work without any responsibilities outside of work. So this model has to be burnt down, so to say. And what we need is a new standard model, this new standard worker model. And this is something that I write for, I've just a shameless plug. I've written the book, The Flexibility Paradox, but recently I've written a report for the European Commission called Flexible Working Arrangements and Gender Equality. And I talk about this in greater detail there for anyone who's interested. But we need to have a new standard worker who is based on the 21st century working mother, someone who has a multitude of responsibility, including self-care. Let's just accept the fact that most of us are going to suffer with some sort of illnesses, disability, mental health problems at one point of our lives, if not in a fluctuating way sometimes. So there is no one in this world who is void of having to do some care work. Again, maybe your children, your elderly parents, your pets, or yourself. And the most important thing is to make sure that people understand that having care work, having care responsibility, it is not at odds with productivity. It is not at odds with performance. That actually being able to make the worker a model where this person has this wealth of responsibilities as well as experiences is actually going to make us better workers and a better society as a whole, especially when you're looking at the aggregate level, when we're looking at the societal level of thinking about the costs of bad working conditions and bad work, but also the huge benefits that we can get from good work. So for example, working hours reduction, even if that worker isn't going to be taking part in the remunerated market economy, that worker will spend time putting back value into society in other ways, which we don't measure through economic means, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? So just to sum up, flexible working can be a great enabler for tackling inequality, but it doesn't really work in the current context. So we really need to be much more reflective about some of the other issues we have surrounding these policies, including kind of our gender norms, but also the way we look at the worker, and that we almost need to start off with a clean slate of redefining who the worker is, adapting our labor laws and policies based on that, and then think about these policies and how they can help us achieve workers' well-being and achieve kind of reduction of gender and other types of inequalities. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Professor Chung, because you showed us many experiences that we live daily at a certain point of view. I think all of us were kind of familiar with some of them, but at the same time, you put it inside a bigger framework, and especially you suggested something in order to intervene. So I think that there will be a lot of discussion and questions about that. I have a lot of questions, for example.
Can I just also say that this book is it's part academic book, but it's also an autobiography as well.
And these are the best books. Okay, so now it's time for Georg Picot, that is going to explore the issue of inequality from another point of view, the point of view of low wages. So, Georg, the floor is yours. Something's happening. Okay. Okay, great.
Thank you so much, Francesco, and thank you for the invitation. It's really a great pleasure to be here. So the title of this conference is What Do Workers Want Today? And I haven't been to all of the panels, but there's one, I think, very important answer to this question that I haven't seen people making yet, and it's this. people, of course, want a canteen with Italian food, maybe even casoncelli from Bergamo. But the title of this panel also has another question, which is, what do workers not want today? And again, I think there is one straightforward answer which we can give even without doing a lot of survey research, and that is workers don't want low wages. The incidence of low-wage employment is measured as the share of employment, and in this case, of full-time employment, which is the only comparable data that we have available. So the share out of employment of workers that are below 2/3 of the median wage. And this graph shows you that this incidence across the EU and the OECD has actually slightly declined in the last years, probably because of decreasing unemployment, but still, according to this data, about 1 out of 7 workers are in low-paid employment. And again, this measure is only based on full-time employment. So obviously, when we take into account non-standard employment, the problem of low pay would be much bigger. In addition, there is, of course, a lot of variation across countries. So it goes all the way down from around like 2 or 3%. Actually, Italy is also pretty low on this incidence, but keep in mind the specific measure that is being used here, and up to like 25% in the United Kingdom. So there's large variation and across countries. In addition, of course, we know that that there's a lot of variation across sectors and across groups in the population. Among other things, women are more often affected by low-wage employment, as this graph shows. And when we look at this data, then the incidence can be as high as among women, almost 1/3 of the full-time workers in Israel, for example. So, against the background of this phenomenon, in the last years, I've been conducting a multi-year research project funded by the Research Council of Norway. And so what I will show to you today are results from the project. Not all the results have been published. Sorry, I feel like I'm too small for this mic, too large for this mic, sorry. Yeah, so that's what this presentation is based on, and I'm still in the process of publishing some of the papers from this research. So going back to low-wage employment, what exactly is the problem with low-wage employment? And there are, of course, many things that can be mentioned. First, there's in-work poverty. When people work full-time and still cannot make a decent living out of it. Then there's, of course, inequality, where low-wage work is a part of what is happening at the lower end of economic inequality. But also low wages can, of course, be a sign of exploitation and sometimes extreme exploitation when we think about vulnerable workers. So all these points are important, but there's another aspect that is a little bit less talked about, and that is that in paying workers very low, that's kind of a genuine disrespect in low pay. And this is an aspect that my friend and colleague Christian Schemmel and I have picked up in a recent article, where we were thinking about what would be the best justification for minimum wages. And then we make the argument that minimum wages are necessary in order to pay respect to those who contribute to society as a social corporation. So here's potentially another answer to the question of this conference, which is, what do workers want? They want respect, at least respect. Obviously, that's not everything they want, but that's an important part of the equation, and that relates a little bit to what Richard Hyman talked about in the previous plenary in terms of dignity being one of the values that is important here. But then going back to the policy, so minimum wages are of course relevant here, as I assume every one of you, most people in this room know, minimum wages can of course be set both by law and by collective bargaining. But then there's also another approach to low pay, which is in a way sort of accepting that there is low pay, but then the state stepping in and paying low earners something on top in terms of public benefits. These are the so-called in-work benefits. The most well-known examples are the earned income tax credit from the US, or what used to be the working tax credit in the UK, which has now been merged into the universal credit. Now, in this project, we were interested in state policies, so we didn't really look at collective bargaining directly, but we were thinking, so what would be the state policy related to collective bargaining? And there would be state support for collective bargaining, which is another policy field that hasn't really gotten so much attention. And so first what we did in the project was that we then took an empirical assessment of the variation of these policies across countries. By the way, I hasten to add that, of course, there are more policies here that we could talk about in the context of low-wage employment. We could talk about employment protection legislation. We could talk about policies like education policies or immigration policies. That all of those obviously are relevant as well. But we want to look at policies that are most specifically targeted at low-wage employment. And so the first thing that we did is we measured the variation of these policies across countries and across time. And then we focused on the politics behind these policies to see what explains that variation. And that's also what will be the rest of my talk. So first I will be talking about cross-national variation and then about the politics. So for mapping the policy variation, this is the list of indicators that we've used. So for statutory minimum wages, we looked simply at the level relative to median wages and at the level setting institutions. For state support for collective bargaining, there's an important conceptual distinction that we make. We focused on support for the organizational conditions for collective bargaining. So basically strong unions, but also strong employer associations going into the bargaining, the conditions for the bargaining. Another way of supporting collective bargaining would be through statutory extensions, but there's an important difference here because that's an ex post support, right? So it takes the results from collective bargaining and then by the force of the law extends them across the sector. And for the support for organizational conditions, we looked at data for right to collective bargaining, right to strike, state support for works councils, Ghent unemployment insurance, and corporatism. And for in-work benefits, we generated a new indicator of the generosity of these benefits across two different types of households, and we hand-coded the existence of these schemes across countries. Now, I should say in the analysis that I will show you, three of these indicators didn't really make a difference empirically, so they were dropped out. And also, in this first part of the talk about the variation of the policies, we actually bracketed, so we didn't cover the statutory extensions, basically for the reasons that I've said before, because we were interested into state support kind of going into the collective bargaining rather than this kind of ex post propping up of collective agreements. Right. So then we used these indicators and we ran confirmatory factor analysis in order to create an indicator for each of these three policies. And the first thing that we found is if we look just at the first two policies, so minimum wage policies and supportive regulation of collective bargaining, there's really a striking correlation here. And so, not only is there a strong correlation, also countries almost sort into these two corners. So countries either have strong minimum wage policies or they have strong policies supporting collective bargaining. But like the really striking part is that they don't do either of the. They don't do neither of the two, because in principle, if collective bargaining is kind of declining, in principle, the state couldn't, the state might not be doing anything. But that's not what we see. There's always one of the two of these, what we could also call wage floor policies. Empirically, this correlation then gives us the opportunity to actually merge these into one measure, which you can see in this graph. So in this graph, on the vertical axis, there's this merged indicator, which we then call stateness of wage floor, where at the top of this axis are countries that are emphasizing statutory minimum wages, and at the bottom there are countries that are emphasizing support for collective bargaining. And on the horizontal axis here you find our indicator for in-work benefit policies. So what do we see here? First of all, we see this kind of inverted L shape, which tells us that there are only relatively well-developed in-work benefit policies in countries that emphasize statutory minimum wages as opposed to those that emphasize collective bargaining. And then in addition, both conceptually and statistically, we can distinguish three groups of countries here, which are basically the three corners of this distribution. In the bottom left, are those that emphasize support for collective bargaining, and we call these wage scale protection. We gave them this name because what we argue is kind of the crucial effect of this approach, that you don't only protect the workers at the very bottom, so you don't only have a wage floor, but you regulate the wage scale, which protects also workers above the minimum from sliding down towards the minimum. Then in the top left, we have this approach where countries basically just have statutory minimum wages and not so much else, so we call this the bare minimum. And in the top right, we have the countries that have well-developed in-work benefits in addition to statutory minimum wages. And since here the state is paying part of the workers' income, we call this the state pay approach. Now, in addition, we also looked into how effective are these three different approaches in terms of reducing low-wage employment. So we ran some panel regressions on this, and what we find is that the bottom left, the wage scale protection approach, is the most effective in reducing low-wage employment. The bare minimum approach is relatively effective, but it really depends on the level of the minimum wages, whether they are high enough. And the worst, from this perspective, is the state pay approach. Actually, we can show that minimum wages have a negative effect, negative effect in the sense of increasing low-wage employment. Which makes sense because when the employers know that workers get something on top, then it makes it easier for them to pay low wages. Right, then we also looked a little bit into changes over time using these indicators, and this is the pattern that we find. So we find a strong tendency across time, and this the period here is from 1960 to 2017. We find a strong tendency for countries to move away from supporting collective bargaining and towards statutory minimum wages, especially more and more countries over the decades introducing statutory minimum wages. We have a shorter time series for the in-work benefit data, only since 2000, and so we don't find such a clear tendency, but still a discernible tendency of also in-work benefits increasing. So if you kind of combine this insight with the changes over time with what we can show are the most effective policies, this poses kind of a puzzle because we can see that basically countries are moving from the most effective policies to the least effective policies. So then this overview of the variation indeed leaves us with these two puzzles. The first one is why have countries moved from the more effective to the less effective policies? And the second, referring back to the first graph, why is there, however, always some kind of wage floor policy? So with this in the back of the mind, then we move into the analysis of the politics of these policies. So first, the politics of the statutory minimum wages. We did also conduct case studies, a case study for the UK and a case study for Norway, but here I will focus on the quantitative results. For this, we've built a data set of 33 OECD countries from 1960 to 2017. And we first ran an event history analysis to explain the introduction of statutory minimum wages, and then we ran fixed effects plenary regressions to explain changes in the levels of minimum wages. And this is what we find. So in terms of when are statutory minimum wages introduced, there's a clear structural driver, and that is decline in collective bargaining, specifically decline in collective bargaining coverage. In addition, however, we do also find a political mechanism, and that is when collective bargaining coverage is low, then it tends to be the left-wing governments that act on this and introduce statutory minimum wages. How about the levels in statutory minimum wages? Here we find that an important political determinant are left-wing parties in government who are more likely to increase statutory minimum wages than right-wing parties. And in addition, there's also an institutional mechanism here. As many in this room are probably aware, there are different institutions for adjusting across countries, different institutions for adjusting minimum wage levels over time. In some countries, like in the US, the government has basically full discretion over setting these levels. In other countries have bipartite or tripartite committees, so bringing in the unions and the employee associations to either advise them or actually take decisions on the minimum wage levels. And the third approach is to have a fixed rule that minimum wage levels are adjusted according to, could be inflation, could be wage developments over time. And what we can show here is that it's fairly straightforward, but still it's nice when you can show it empirically that it's only when the government actually has control over the minimum wage levels that the difference in political parties has an effect on the wage levels. Right, then moving on to in-work benefits, the politics of this, and this is actually work by Siri Pedersen and Joan Abbas, who were employed on the project, but this is one of the few papers where I was not directly involved. And they first argued that theoretically, what the impact of political parties would be on in-work benefits is not really so obvious, because left-wing parties, on the one hand, especially traditional social democratic parties, you would expect them to align with unions, and you don't really expect unions to be positive about in-work benefits, because unions want basically wages and salaries to be good enough so that people can get by without money from the state. However, in-work benefits are, of course, also policies for people who are worse off, for workers who are struggling. So in that sense, they can also, in principle, be seen as a left-wing policy. However, what they do show empirically is that indeed it's the right-wing governments who more often expand in-work benefits, and left governments are even less inclined to support in-work benefits when bargaining coverage is high. So this makes a lot of sense. And then finally, what about the politics of state support for collective bargaining? Here, indeed, we do actually focus on statutory extensions, so slightly different focus in terms of the exact policies here. And I should say the work here is still quite preliminary, but our findings so far show that higher union density is associated with more use of statutory extensions. More corporatism is also associated with more extensions. However, there are, of course, clear exceptions to this. So Denmark and Sweden do not use statutory extensions at all. And these are, of course, two of the countries with the highest union density and two very clearly corporatist countries. However, this is in line with what we would expect, because when unions are strong enough and have basically achieve high coverage out of their own organizational strength, they don't really want statutory extensions, this is very clear in Denmark and Sweden that they don't want the state to interfere. So this makes a lot of sense. It's actually part of our prediction, but it doesn't really show up in the data overall. So our prediction for union density would actually be a curvilinear function, where at the very top of union density, the use of statutory extensions goes down, but it doesn't show up in the data because we don't really have so many countries with such high union density empirically. Right. So with this, I already moved towards the conclusions. So I've shown you the empirical variation of these policies to tackle low-wage employment across countries and to some extent over time, and the puzzles that this poses, and then our research that we've done on the politics. So let's go back to these puzzles in terms of the variation. First, the puzzle, why have policies moved from more to less effective policies? And here, fundamental is, of course, the decline in collective bargaining, which, of course, has many structural drivers, such as the move towards service economies, pressures from globalization, but also political measures deliberately undermining collective bargaining. But the point is that once this decline in collective bargaining is in process, then what we can show is that this basically leads to negative feedback effects as actors adapt their preference to the new realities that they're facing. And first, what we see is that, well, when unions are faced with, bargaining power eroding, they actually turn towards statutory minimum wages and towards statutory extensions. So they adapt their strategy. And similarly, left-wing parties, when in government, tend to join unions in this endeavor, and then it's left-wing governments that are most often responsible for introducing statutory minimum wages. There are exceptions, by the way. When collective bargaining declines, also left-wing parties kind of open up for the idea of in-work benefits. So these are these kind of negative feedback effects in terms of policy adjustments responding to this erosion of collective bargaining. Now you could say, well, why do they in a way just give up and move the focus towards statutory minimum wages and statutory extensions and in-work benefits? How about, isn't there this third policy, which is exactly to support collective bargaining? But that approach depends on a lot of conditions. First of all, you have to be really early, because if you're not early, given these negative feedback effects that I have shown, then it's sort of too late. Then the whole sort of process of reorienting is already underway. Another reason is that, well, to have really successful and effective support for collective bargaining, it kind of relies on well-established corporatism, which, for example, we show in our case study of Norway. But also another thing that is very sensitive here is that the state has to kind of treat very carefully when it intervenes in collective bargaining and has to avoid to actually crowd out the collective bargaining. And then a final factor in terms of why have countries moved from less effective to more effective is quite simple. Well, politics, in the sense that right-wing governments, as we have shown, actually do promote in-work benefits. What about the other puzzle? So why is there always a wage floor policy, either support for collective bargaining or statutory minimum wages? Well, it's a little bit related to what I said before about the adaptation of preferences. So unions, and this has been also shown in a very nice paper by Brett Meyer, so unions, when they see that bargaining is no longer viable for all, for a sufficient number of workers, they adapt their strategy and start lobbying for minimum wages. So that's kind of, as one policy declines, unions and then also other actors, as I've shown, start to mobilize for the other policy. But the other factor here is, of course, electoral democracy. So it is electoral democracy that then enables left-wing governments to come into power and to support unions in this effort. But also, I argue that electoral democracy matters here also in a more general way, because there are kind of general electoral incentives why it's not politically viable when government is accountable to voters to just not have anything at all, so that theoretically it's like possible to pay workers ridiculously small amounts. That is not a viable situation in an electoral democracy. And so there we perhaps come back to this point that I mentioned earlier, that it is perhaps really this idea that there's a question of respect here that is quite intuitive to a lot of people, and why minimum wages make sense to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Georg, for your rich presentation and for introducing us to the project that you're doing, you've done, that I think is very connected to a lot of researches that as ADAPT we are doing in the last years between about the connection between collective bargaining, the role of the state, and all these relationships. So we have around 25-30 minutes for Q&A. So we have a good time. So Professor Weiss, the first one, Diletta, the second one, and Guglielmo, the third one. So we connect the first three questions. And
well, thank you very much. I have a very short question. As far as the relationships between statutory minimum wage and collective bargaining are concerned, I'm doubting whether it makes sense to look at the country. In my view, it might be more interesting to look at sectors. For example, in my country, in Germany, you know, if you would look statutory minimum wage and metal industry, you would get a totally different result. For example, statutory minimum wage and food industry. You know, the question is, do you also think that it might be interesting to just go further into the sectoral differences?
Thank you, Professor Weiss. Diletta?
Yes, thank you. I also have a question for Professor Picot. You mentioned the decline in collective bargaining coverage as one of the main causes for the introduction of the statutory minimum wage. Of course, a very, well, relevant example of this is Germany, as we all know, which here in Italy there is also a very rich debate about the introduction of a statutory minimum wage, even if our collective bargaining still resists for now. And I was wondering, but actually the Italian trade unions, some Italian trade unions argue that the introduction of a statutory minimum wage might in fact be a cause for the decline of the collective bargaining coverage, so the opposite. I was wondering if in your project you investigated also this kind of correlation, or if you, aim to do this in the future. Thank you.
Guglielmo?
I have a question for both. Trying to put together the two presentations, and it is how do we implement statutory hourly minimum wages to the firms of work that Jan was talking about? Who and how is going to count the working hours of people, for instance, working from home? And then I have just a little methodological question on to Georg. I really like your research and all your presentation. But when you have that amount of observations, which is the OECD countries or European countries. There is the problem with Scandinavian countries, because it's few people, but it's a lot of countries. And it's few, any regression, and we never really know whether things work because it's the policies or it's because they are Scandinavian. I remember when there was debate about flexicurity, and some countries tried to imitate flexicurity, they didn't automatically become like Denmark. Sometimes it was a bit of a disaster. I'm not going to mention the country because it's impolite where we are.
Thank you, Guillermo. So maybe we can start with Georg, that has several answers to give.
Okay, thank you so much for these questions. That's super interesting. First, to Professor Weiss's question, that's an entirely correct point about, sectors are extremely important in how minimum wages interact with collective bargaining. What I would say, and it's definitely very interesting to explore this more. By the way, in that respect, I can actually recommend the research by some others. Dingeldie, Grimshaw, and Rubery and others have published a book about the interaction between collective bargaining and minimum wages. As far as I'm concerned, I would defend myself with that our objective was to look at policies, And so while your point, of course, still holds, but what is decisive for us is how these different sectoral dynamics aggregate at the national level to change than policies. To Diletta, well, I'm very grateful for your question because I do actually have a paper on this. It's written together with Michal Kosak and Peter Starke and published in the British Journal of Industrial Relations, where we want to analyze exactly this, exactly this specifically for union density. Like one of the worries that unions use, not only in Italy, but also in Scandinavia and other countries, is that minimum wages can undermine the incentives to join unions. It's important to say that's not the only worry that unions have about minimum wages, but that's one common argument. And since we were all based in Scandinavia, we heard this argument so often, we were like, yeah, but is it actually true? And we were struck by the fact that there wasn't really any empirical research on this. Like everyone kept referring to this argument, but there wasn't any empirical research. So we wanted to analyze it, and here I really care about stressing that we were very open to what we were going to find, because we're not, counter to what it might look like, we're not actually these kind of advocates of, minimum wages are good regardless. Like there are many aspects which are kind of which can be problematic or just kind of insufficient with minimum wages. So we were very open to what we find, but actually we could not find a negative effect of minimum wages on union density. So we tried it with different data sets, with different methods. We could not confirm such a negative effect. And then Guglielmo, wow, obviously two difficult questions there. I'm slightly inclined to dodge the first question and pass it on to Hee-jung, because I feel this must be a question that is kind of a general problem with home working, right? It's a general problem of how do you monitor the workers working from home. So I'm sure Hee-jung has more to say about this. Regarding the methods, well, I see a point with the Scandinavian countries, and especially also with the experience from the debate about flexicurity. However, I would say that in principle, it's an empirical multivariate research. We are controlling for as much as we can. In some of these regressions, we're using fixed effects. And if you say, And I don't know whether that's a valid answer, but if you say like Scandinavian countries, few people, and many countries, well, what about the Baltic countries? You know, I mean, it's a general problem in this kind of research. But I feel through adequate controls and regression design, it can be accounted for. Thank you,
Professor Chang.
Yes, I'll just answer that working time issue. So, to be honest, I think the issue around working time becomes a real problem when we have lower boundaries, though not just working from home, but also flexible schedules. But having said that, for a lot of lower income workers who are working from home, there are a lot of mechanisms that employers use to track working hours, maybe through cameras, through all sorts of kind of VPN tracking, etc. So actually, those workers are not as almost problematic. So we've seen examples of like call center workers who, a lot of them work from home, where there are mechanisms to do that. But it's actually much more of an issue once we go into slightly more knowledge worker kind of base, where it's like, if you check your email from your phone, is that working hours? If it's like in the evening or in the weekends, or, there is a huge boundary blurring in terms of the definition of what is work and what isn't work. But also we think of academics as well. When you're like going on a jog and then you're thinking about your papers, is that work? Or like when you're in the conference and you go out for dinner with colleagues and you have a great time and you have some nice Italian wine, but is that work? And I think this is why this whole right to disconnect is super important for these types of workers. So to kind of engender a culture where we know that from the scientific literature that having ample time mentally and physically away from work is really important, right? So to make sure that if we can't control and define or measure working hours, and we can't really use the legislative kind of tools that are in the working hours directives to, let's say, prevent workers from overtime or prevent managers from making workers work overtime and over hours, maybe what we need to start looking at is how much rest time we need to make sure to prevent. And I'm not talking about the ILO definition of minimum rest time, but proper ample rest that could actually benefit productivity rest time. So this is why, again, right to disconnect doesn't quite have that in it now, but I think as we move along, these kind of legislations and policies have to come in place.
Thank you. We have time for a second round of questions. Ilaria, then Emanuele.
I have a question for Professor Chung, because if I understood correctly, you suggested to promote flexible working no more as a way to boost work-life balance, but more as a way to boost productivity. But my question also derives from the fact that talking with some employers, but also with workers, they realize that flexible working, and especially working from home or outside the premises of the company, may compromise workers' capacity to engage with colleagues, to ask for advice in quite an immediate way, because of course this could imply to pick up the phone and maybe also write an email. So this is something quite more difficult than the immediate interaction that you could have in an office when you share the same place. And this could so somehow flexible working could compromise this relational part of the work, with effects not only on workers' well-being and the workers' possibility to enjoy their work, but also with negative effect possibly on productivity. And that's why I would just wanted to ask whether if you happened to make the same observations in your research, or maybe not. So, thank you.
Emanuele. C'è spazio per un'altra domanda, se volete, preparatevi.
My question is still for Professor Chung, and it's about the role of legislation in overcoming the flexibility paradox. Not mainly on the right to disconnect, which I think it's very important, but on access to flexible work arrangements? Because you mentioned that in the UK, 30% of person asking for a flexible work arrangement were receiving a negative answer. And as a labor law researcher, and I think that other persons in this room did the same, we used to mention the UK legislation on flexible working as a best practice because it is not limited to some specific categories, but it is broader and it applies to everyone. So my question is, how can legislation help overcome this kind of flexibility paradox, and what are the shortcomings that you have seen, you have analyzed in the current legislation? I can make another example, that is the one in the Netherlands, where they have introduced a specific legislation with a need to address the request and some more specific duties to consider the request for flexible work arrangements, which seems to be a useful way forward. I don't know what is your opinion. Thanks.
Last question. Yeah.
My question is for Professor Chung. I'm Chiara Altilio, PhD candidate at University of Siena and ADAPT Research Fellow. In my PhD thesis, I'm investigating about work-life balance policies and collective bargaining. And until now, I found that most of the time, flexible working scheme in CBAs are a solution to work-life balance issue of workers. So my question is, what can collective bargaining do to resolve the paradox you talked about before, and also to even avoid the inequalities you talked about? Thank you.
Okay, so Professor Chung, I think most of the questions are for you this round, so please.
So I'm going to start with the last question because I mean, I don't know if this is a coincidence, but I've been talking to the unions quite recently, a lot recently. So I was at the UK Trade Union Congress, that's the umbrella body of the UK trade unions, yesterday. And about a week or two ago, I was addressing UNI Europa, another kind of umbrella organization. This one is specifically kind of looking at representation of the finance services sector unions across Europe. And we were all talking about the role of collective bargaining. And I know that this, like, I'm not going to be able to go into too much detail, but what I can say is collective bargaining is super important for not only enabling workers access to flexible working, reducing inequalities in access to flexible working, but also ensuring that, as the last kind of question asked, enabling that it doesn't result in the paradox. One of the things is because even if, and again, kind of it leads to the to the second question. Even if you have good legislation where, like the UK, you say, oh, right to flexible working was expanded to all workers in 2014, it didn't really have teeth. One of the reasons were because in the legislation, if you look carefully, employers had lots of different opportunities to reject it, and that rejection. Really, the onus of request and everything had lied within the workers. So now, compared to the Dutch case where the onus lies much more on the employers to be very specific about why it cannot be adapted. There has been some changes in the last year where the UK government has asked now to ensure that employers are the ones that are much more specific about these kind of causes for change. But again, in countries where there is stronger unions, stronger collective bargaining, and stronger workers' rights, including not only through unions, but also through maybe tribunal. These are the countries where these rights are going to be stronger. But also, it also provides workers perhaps with also a sense of security, because one of the reasons why people don't even ask for flexible working is because of the retribution. And again, it's so with the collective bargaining, with the paradox, one of the things we see again in case studies of unions, the biggest reason, or probably one of the reasons why there is more kind of paradoxical kind of overwork cultures and people do a lot of digital presenteeism, or where you have these negative outcomes on well-being, has to do especially in cases where flexible working is given as an individual-based arrangement. Now, this has been the case in the US, for example, and also in a lot of European countries. But when flexible working is given as an individual kind of gift, this is where you're going to see a lot of problems, because you are going to be penalized, you're going to feel like you're going to be penalized, you're going to overwork, etc. Right? Whereas some really good cases we see with some trade unions in the UK and other countries is that once you have a collective bargained flexibilities, let's say collectively bargained that you all work 2 or 3 days at home and everybody does it, with the, again, secure mechanisms from the unions to make sure that employers do not penalize these workers, then you see that these policies are, result in better outcomes. And I'm not saying, okay, just kind of going back to that first question, it's like, I'm not saying necessarily that you should never use flexible working as a work-life balance policy. The problem is when you only see it as a work-life balance policy for parents or carers. Despite all the goodwill and despite the linkages that we show how good work-life balance leads to productivity, good well-being leads to productivity, job satisfaction leads to productivity and performance, economic performance outcomes in companies, when you frame these policies, it doesn't matter if it's flexible working, it doesn't matter if it's 4-day a week, it doesn't matter if it's maternity, paternity leave. Once you start framing it just as a work-life balance policy and not as a smart working, not as a productivity policies, you see people being penalized and managers having a hesitation in terms of implementation. So this is really about just a mindset, and unfortunately there are social norms that dictate that these policies are still seen in a certain way. And what I'm trying to say is that we are trying to undo some of those norms or biases through the repackaging or relabeling or using different wording when using these policies. And then the other question that the first person has asked about, what can we do in terms of... Okay, actually, I'll go to the second point. I did talk about it a little bit more, is that I think we need to have stronger rights for flexible working with surrounding mechanisms to protect workers. And again, I think collective bargaining or more the collectivized approach to flexible working could be much beneficial. But one of the other things we find is that countries where there are generous family policies, generously, like it could be childcare policy, it could be leave policies, especially where policies promote fathers to be more involved, you see less of a problem in terms of access as well as outcomes of flexible working. The isolation issue, it is a big issue only because at the moment, a lot of companies and across countries have introduced flexible working without changing any other aspects of their work, right? And that's a big problem. So you have to have a system, you have to completely rehaul the system of the way you work. You can't expect people to do the same work when they're at home and in the office. There are really benefits to be together. Like today, like you guys are here today. Can you imagine if you're all here today, but you're doing your normal, paper writing or something? Like that would be completely a waste of time, right? And it's the same thing with offices. If you're only coming into the office once or 2 times a week, and you should only do that really, is that you should be using those opportunities to do the learning, mentoring, culture building, socializing. And again, I want to emphasize socializing. Socializing in the office was a byproduct in the in-office days, but now we have to very intentionally make sure that workers have time to socialize. Not just go from meeting to meeting in these in-office days, but really socialize, because those water cooler moments are quite precious in terms of building collaborative cultures. And with that, also one of the things we have to understand is that the office was actually a really bad place sometimes for focused work because of that, because people were interrupting you all the time. So in a way, use the opportunity of focused work at home, and use the opportunity of the engagement when in the office. And you could actually, and this is, by the way, for anyone who's interested, these are called anchor days or engagement days, and there's quite a bit of literature on that now, maybe more in the gray literature, but that we need to redesign how things are done, and not just kind of do the same work, but sometimes in the office and sometimes at home.
Thank you. Thank you to both speakers for their very, very interesting speeches, and also thank you to all for the discussion. We are perfectly on time. This was the last plenary session. We have a last session of workshops. Let me thank you all for coming, because it's the last moment in which I have all here. Thank you for coming. Thank you for trust us in coming to this conference. Thank you for our technician, to Tommaso, all the staff. And see you next year from the 26th to the 28th of November in Bergamo. Thank you.
Bene, grazie.
Grazie a te.
Da lontano. Sì. L'applicazione un collegamento. Sì, basta che te lo mettono solo.
Giorgio, riusciamo a cambiare il quadro? Thank you.
Otherwise, you see everybody.
Thank you.
I like it very much. I have about another question. What do you think about the basic income, universal basic income? I'm Claudia. The thought of the world. What do you think about
Faccio parlare dal podio.
universal basic income?
Va bene, dal podio.
What do you think? You are party there? You are critical about this?
Esatto.
Questo funziona?
L'ultima informazione.